Dr. Margaret Carreiro is Professor Emerita from the Biology Department at the University of Louisville, where I can attest she was a beloved faculty member for 18 years. She hails from Boston and New York originally, right, Margaret?
I'm from the Boston area, but I lived in the New York City area for 10 years.
There you go. But she's been here in Louisville for 20 years. One of her great achievements at the University of Louisville was planting the Harriet A. Corbage native plant garden, which is a beautiful and healthy addition to the campus that's flourished for years. Her knowledge about ecological health of native plant gardening and sustainability is vast, and we are so glad that she's here to share her knowledge with all of us. So let's welcome Dr. Margaret Carreiro.
Okay. Well, I guess now I will share my screen with you all and not mess this up. Okay. So far, so good, I think. And come on. And this really delightful laser pointer, that thing that I just found out about, you can see it wiggling there. I might want to point things out to you now and then. But I'll first start off by, hello, good evening, everyone. I want to thank Tracy and the Louisville Free Library for the opportunity to give you my sales pitch this evening. I only wish that I could actually see all of you out there. I am an ecologist and a recently retired U of L biology professor. And as a scientist, I did my research trying to understand how cities affect nature. And so I guess you would expect me to care about the fate of species who are the fellow travelers on this earth with us. And you'd be right. And now, more than ever, is a critical time, I think, for scientists like me to convey to folks like you, not only how badly so many species are doing on the planet right now, but what ordinary people can do about it besides donate to nature conservation organizations. I know you're a receptive audience out there, and you're here because you are interested in creating gardens that can do a better job of sustaining nature around us in cities. And gardens that are not only beautiful to our eyes, but also life affirming. So this is a talk where I hope to convey not only how we can garden better for nature, but also answer the question of why we should do it by putting our personal gardens in a larger ecological context. Because where most people see a garden, I see a potential conservation space. And although I will give you lots of ways, I'll list ways how we can do this, what will limit an ecological transformation of the places where we live, cities and towns, it is really boils down to one factor, and that's humans caring about sustaining non-human earthlings in whatever way we can. And I do not mean only the most beautiful or charismatic species in nature, which in cities are likely to be birds, but the smaller species, the less charismatic, or perhaps ones that you may even have a personal aversion to. It's these small species who actually run the living systems of this world. And it's plants that feed them. So let's begin. So the word for caring about other species is the word that's been used now for some time called biophilia, literally loving of life. And it means caring for other organisms besides ourselves. And we already do this. People show their love for other species in a lot of ways. And some examples, well, you know them. It's our pets and our houseplants. And we bring these species indoors because they become members of our family, really. And it's a one way that we show our love of other creatures. And so because humans are becoming much more of an indoor species in the last 100 years, our pets and houseplants, they're all indoors. We love them, we take care of them. And what I'm asking us to do now is, can we take that same care and feeling and bring it to the outdoor world and care about those species that surround us? Because there are species all around us in cities. It's a matter of which ones, and how can we bring out the ones that need the most attention and are our local native species. So if some of you have to leave before I'm done, here's like the big take-home messages for this talk is, why start gardening for nature? Well, because a lot of species are in big trouble right now, and I call this SOS time, save our species time. The other is that, believe it or not, ordinary people in cities and towns can indeed make a big difference for native species survival where development has already happened. Nature isn't always out there, it's here around you, and you can bring a lot more local nature at your doorstep if you so choose. And by doing so, this can be a real win-win for both nature and people. So not only are we saving our species, but we're saving ourselves and maybe even saving our souls. Well, it shouldn't be too surprising that other species are in really deep trouble right now. Many are going extinct. And that's because we've been very busy the last particularly 200 years claiming the earth for ourselves, and therefore taking over habitat that other species have needed. And so in this sort of the kind of the downside of this talk is showing you just how starkly terrible the situation is right now. And back 5 years ago, World Wildlife Fund came out with the Living Planet report, in which they showed that since 1970, a year in my young adulthood, and maybe, you know, for many of you out there as well, I mean, this is not like ancient history. We were young adults at the time. Since that time, Earth's vertebrate populations, those organisms with backbones, the big guys, their population sizes have decreased by about 60%. And freshwater species are really plummeting. Their population sizes have really declined by 80%. And they forecast that by 2020, and that was last year, populations would have declined by 2/3 from 1970. These are vertebrates, okay? It's pretty awful. And bird watchers and ornithologists, a lot of citizen scientists are involved with birds. They recently let us know just how bad the situation is for birds. And in the US and Canada alone, about 3 billion birds are missing since 1970. In other words, 1 in every 4 birds that existed back then has vanished. The population sizes. So we're not talking about species there, but just the sizes of the populations. And of course, some organisms really, some birds take a bigger hit than others. And namely, I want to point out grassland birds over here. They've plummeted by more than 50%. And that's because in Canada and the US, grasslands, or the prairies, etc., are the very places where we grow our food, our grain belts. So we've co-opted their spaces even more since 1970. But what should trouble us even more is what's now been dubbed the Insect Armageddon. And basically asking, where have all the insects gone? And it first came, an alert first came to our attention in 2013 when some German scientists decided to repeat an experiment that had been done in 1989, and they redid it in 2013, 24 years later, in a nature reserve, which is a good place, right? You'd expect, oh, they should be doing okay in a nature reserve in Germany. And here in this graph, you can see that the bars mean the weight or grams, the actual biomass of insects collected in 1989 in light green in different months of May through October. And then here in July, when they had huge numbers of insects back then, look at where it was in 2013. this should set the alarm bells going. And it did, and it prompted some other studies. But first, I will let you know, like, why care about the insects going, right? Well, first of all, insects are in the middle of food webs, and they're food. They're food for many of the species we care about, like birds. And perhaps you didn't realize that they really depend on insects to raise their young. Chickadees alone, they have to feed their young in a nest 6,000 to 9,000 caterpillars in 16 days so those little nestlings can fledge. And hummingbirds, right now everyone's delighted, the hummingbirds are coming back. Everyone's trying to put out their sugar water feeders, I know. And, but just like people, you don't raise a kid feeding them dessert all the time, right? You don't give them sugar all the time. Hummingbirds really for energy, but to maintain themselves and to grow young, they need protein. And where do they get their protein? Insects and spiders. 80% of their diet is insects and spiders. You want to feed hummingbirds, the best thing to do is, I'll show you later, is have a garden that supports insects and spiders. But there are people impacts too. And this has been coming out more and more, but maybe you don't know about this. In China now, entire regions, their orchard growing regions, they lost all their bees. That's it, no more bees. They can't count on bees to pollinate their fruit trees. So perhaps you can see here on the left side, this Chinese woman, okay, with a long stick. She climbed up on the orchard tree. She's got a long stick with a little brush at the end, and she is pollinating, cross-pollinating every single flower on that tree in order to get fruit. Can you imagine? I mean, at least China has a lot of people in it, so labor costs are low. But can you imagine if we had to resort to that in the United States? Already we're paying like 75 cents or so for a big apple in some supermarkets. Can you imagine if we lost our pollinator bees? I mean, a lot of these bees that pollinate our orchards are actually native bees, not just the honeybee. So this would be catastrophic for fruits and vegetables if we lost our bees. So there were other studies that this German study prompted, 73 insect studies worldwide that showed this isn't just happening in Germany. And after they concluded that we could lose 40% of the world's insect species in just the next few decades. And not all insects, of course, but some groups are really in trouble, and the most dire are butterflies and moths, native bees, including the bumblebee, which you might see here, and beetles like the ladybug, which is in our native species of ladybugs are in real trouble. And especially also aquatic insects, especially the larvae of dragonflies, stoneflies, caddisflies, and mayflies. And I don't know if any of you out there are fisher people, you like to go fishing in streams, but I think if you do, you recognize these as fish food. So they have really, they're in deep trouble, and that means the fish will be in trouble too. But there's another indicator of insect loss over the last decades that maybe some of you older folks like me might guess at, that you can coarsely tell that times have changed. You remember this? Driving around town or in the outskirts of town and getting your windows just totally crashing into bugs all the time. And, probably cursing because now you got to clean the windshield and your headlights and everything else. Well, we don't see this as much anymore, and there's a good reason for it. And the main one is we're losing our insects. So that's a good indicator. We are in the middle of Earth's 6th mass extinction on this planet. The current rates of species extinction have been estimated to be anywhere from 1,000 to 10,000 times those before humans dominated the planet. So it's a big crisis. And extinction of species also means extinction of human experience with nature. So species loss is also a loss for us in many ways, both practical and aesthetic and spiritual. And not just scientists, I just wanted to show you quickly that artists are out there trying to raise awareness of this species extinction crisis too. And they can reach people in a different way than scientists like me can. And this is a form of biophilia, caring. Well, people haven't been sitting on their hands watching this crisis and doing nothing, of course. We have been doing quite as much as we can. And there have been two main methods in which we're trying to save Earth species, and that's setting aside nature reserves, conservation, and restoration of degraded land and waters. So some scientists said, well, if we continue to do this, can we save a reasonable cross section of Earth's creatures by doing just using these two tools? Okay, and the answer sadly is no. And the reason is that we can't acquire land in large enough parcels in all locations needed now because it's too costly. And restoration really only works best for native species if the areas are not too degraded to begin with. So they've done back of the envelope calculations, and the forecast is if we can reserve and restore, just using those two tools, 5 to 10% of Earth's land, which would be a stretch, that would be incredible. Perhaps we could save 5% of the species now alive over the next 100 to 200 years. That's it. So we got to start thinking out of the box. We need a new approach to conservation, and it's called reconciliation ecology. And basically that means inventing, establishing, maintaining new habitats to conserve species diversity right where we live, work, and play. Okay, and it doesn't have to just be cities, by the way. And this is espoused in this really great book, which you may want to read. It's a little old now. It's maybe, I'm gonna guess 17 years old or something, but I'll tell you, it's very inspiring. It's realistic, but inspiring. And Michael Rosenzweig is a very well-regarded, internationally well-known ecologist, scientist who wrote this book in a very engaging way. It's meant for the public. I recommend it. And so how can we redesign human-dominated landscapes in particular to support more native species without detracting from our use? Because let's face it, people aren't very good about sharing too well. If it means that it diminishes their use, they're not going to like it a whole lot, and it won't work. You've heard of green roofs, you've heard of green walls. I mean, those are a couple of approaches to doing this in cities. But where there is low-hanging fruit, where can we create these win-win situations for both us and nature? Because surely we can do a heck of a lot better than this. This is suburbia in Jefferson County, aerial photos I took back in 2001. And this is, I don't know about you, but this depresses me because we could do better. And we need Biophilia to come to the rescue. So where are the low-hanging fruit? It's our yards. So what exactly though? I wanted to know what's the potential for sharing more of our yard space with, native wildlife. And so I had a student who was learning how to use GIS. This is an outline you can see here of Jefferson County, okay? Louisville downtown is right about here, okay? And the question was, well, how much of Jefferson County land is residential? And it turns out 43% of the county's land is residentially zoned, okay? And then the next question is, because, we have houses and streets and driveways and sidewalks, how much of that land, okay, is plantable, okay? And for a county that's 333 square miles, okay, 120 square miles 36% of the county is residentially zoned, but it's the plantable space that's residentially zoned. And that's the blue on this map over here. That's a lot, over a third of the county. And, just for comparison, the places where we normally think nature should be is our parklands here. And we have a really good, parklands here. Metro parks, which you see here in green. And I couldn't get the parklands to show up because there was no layer because it's not a metro park, but it's over here, the parklands. And if you combine that area with all the green here, it's only 20 square miles of parkland, 6% of the county. Right? Now I know we're not going to convert all of the plantable space in the county to, in our yards to pollinator gardens, but if even we did 10% of it, okay, it would add 50% to the 6%, another 3-something% to that amount that is, for nature. And we can do that. But before we do, why do it? How would planting for wildlife in these residential plantable space locations help conservation? Because just maybe 10 to 20 years ago, wildlife conservationists just thought cities, oh, they're lost causes, don't even bother with them. When I first came here, I tried to find out how many frogs, toads, salamanders, whatever were in our park system here in the county or in the county. And at the time, Fish and Wildlife, there was just a big whiteout for Jefferson County. Basically, they're not even bothering looking in the county because it's urbanized. So, but now they have. But I'll tell you, that's how quickly they've changed their minds about nature in the city. It does exist and it can be fostered and sustained. So what would having our yards, more of this plantable blue in pollinator gardens and such do for the wildlife? Well, first of all, yeah, it creates more habitat for small wildlife and plants. Okay, we're not talking about saving lions and tigers and bears here in cities, but it also would provide stepping stones across a harsh urban land. It provides gas stations in a sense, or rest areas for species that are moving across harsh urban terrain. A lot of them do. It would also, if you look at this beige on the map, those are clipped out areas that are surrounding our park system within a certain distance. And if you have gardens in your own yards in these places, having friendly habitat in there is important as a buffer for the parklands that do exist. And therefore it connects up this entire landscape better for species on the move, because they are. So it's a lot more ecologically functional for species. And what we're about in conservation in cities isn't about, saving some rare species or something. What we're trying to do is keep common species common. So all of you, we need you to become conservation managers on your own yards in your own space, if you're lucky enough to have a yard, okay? Because our park systems just cannot do it alone. We need you. And it's all hands on deck time. Now, I know what you've been thinking. You've been saying, well, don't we already plant in our yards? Of course we do. So let's take a walk around my neighborhood and see what we're planting. I took these photos on a walk one day and I said, oh, let me take some pictures and illustrate this. So what do you see? Can't hear you, but I know what you're thinking. It's lawns, so it's about what kind of nature we're sustaining. What are we planting? And, what kind of nature do we value already? And I can tell you by watching a poor monarch butterfly on that very street on the left, dipping and running around looking. I mean, it was trying to find something to nectar on, and it was in the fall. And couldn't find a thing. I felt so sorry for it. But same thing goes for our native bees. Essentially, these lawns, for the most part, are food deserts for a lot of our pollinators. But, there are a species or two that, really enjoy our turf grasses. And so which ones use lawns as a main course? I think you'll recognize this one. And of course, they do their best to recycle nutrients and fertilize. They really do. But it's no wonder that they're on all this turf and lawns, because we have basically reproduced their nesting habitat in the Canadian tundra. And they love it here, and then they decide, many of them, to just stay all year round. So one of the important barriers that we have to get over to make our cities, transform our cities to be more friendly spaces for our local native species, is changing what's called the industrial lawn aesthetic. I'm not talking about small patches of just, your grass with a clover in it. We're talking people who must have like the perfect turf lawn in particular. So yeah, we like lawns, but do we have to have so much of it? Lawns are the largest single crop in land area in the USA, 3 times more than we plant in corn. It's an area the size of Texas, if we put it all together. And 40% of households with yards use lawn care and landscape services. And we spend almost $100 billion a year on lawn care. And, this is an industry, and the industry is pushing this all the time in its ads and everywhere else. You got to have that perfect lawn, right? Or your neighbors, will despise you somehow. I think you're inadequate. Also, many homeowners associations require them. And so they're a cultural expectation, but they use a lot of resources in terms of water, 9 billion gallons a day. And that's potable water, right? Drinkable water that's been, processed, that's expensive water, and we're using it to water turf grass. We use a lot of fertilizer on it, and most of that winds up polluting groundwater, streams, and coastal waters. Eutrophication, you may have heard about. And if you want to keep it in that single species mix, or, God forbid, should there be a dandelion trying to grow in there, we use a lot of synthetic pesticides, herbicides, insecticides, fungicides, etc., to keep them perfect green all year round, even if you live in a desert. Also, if you still have a gas-powered mower, which I think most people still do, that's a lot of gasoline burned, and it's the most inefficient engine. It's a single-stroke engine, pollutes a lot. In fact, 11 times more air pollutants per hour than a car. And we actually also, when we're trying to fill it up with gasoline, there's a lot of gasoline spilled on the ground, etc. 17 million gallons per year is estimated to be just spilled by homeowners. That's almost, that's 70% more than was spilled in the Exxon Valdez spill up in Alaska in 1989. All those resources and pollution, and we don't even eat it. Do you think we could make an offering to nature of just 10% of this lawn area and convert it to a native plant pollinator garden? Just 10%, hopefully more, but 10% would be good. And then you're going to say, well, people often grow more than just grass on their property, and that's true. And this is again along that walk, and this is very lovely, a nice big, chunk of flowers. Here a little less so, and this one is a little teeny bit. And while something is always better than nothing, and this will attract some pollinators, but what I'm asking you to think about is this really enough to be called habitat for these smaller creatures like pollinators? And also the types of plants chosen. The horticultural industry is another big one, and they mostly sell species that originated in either Europe or Asia, not our natives. And yes, they may be beautiful, but you got to ask yourself, do they all have, wildlife value? For instance, knockout roses, which I know people plant a lot because they just keep on giving that gorgeous red color all the time. Well, they have no nectar. They have a little bit of pollen, but no nectar. And people usually love to select double flowering species, the big ones with all these petals, right? Double zinnias and double this and that. Well, all those extra petals are the way you get them when you're growing them and selecting them is that the plant is regressing. It's converting what was once stamens and the female and male parts of the flower, the reproductive organs, and making them regress. It's selecting the ones where they regressed into more petals. That's where the petals come from, at the cost of stamens and pistils, the reproductive organs of flowers. So they offer, if a few of them might have a little bit, but they offer little to no pollen or nectar. So while these can be a feast for the eyes, they're not a feast for our fellow earthlings like bees and butterflies. So what species you grow is very important. So it's kind of obvious if you've got a large space and you make it into a big garden, that the larger the garden you can plant, you're starting to create a real community and food webs. You're starting to establish that in your garden, and the larger the better. But if you don't have the space, believe me, small something is better as a stepping stone for these creatures than nothing. But the larger the garden, the better. And the more native plants in it, then you can support more of our native pollinators, birds, and small mammals. It's okay to have some things that aren't native species. I have some too. But I make sure that they're not the kind that can invade into our natural areas. They're not invasives. And what you're seeing here are 3 views at different times a year of my own backyard garden. And if you ask me, in terms of the horticulture industry, I mean, why aren't these considered beautiful? Excuse me, please. I don't know. I sure think they are. So let's go dig in a little deeper into the ecology of a pollinator garden. And these are my suggestions or recommendations for you to think about. What native plants can you grow for supporting these small creatures? And I get this second question asked of me a lot, or a statement of woe is me. People say, oh, I don't have a lot of sun. I can't grow a pollinator garden, because somehow people think that they have to have a sunny space. Not so. It just depends on which species you can grow. If you have a shady space, you can do it too, and I'll show you in a minute. And then lastly, I want to talk a little bit about how there's other things you can do to manage your yard for wildlife other than the growing of plants and the provision of water. So if you stand back a little, to create a pollinator habitat in your yard, what is it you have to think about? Just think about it. It's an organism. What does it need to survive? Well, first off, it does need food, and it's going to need some other things too, and I'll get to that rest of the list in a second. So first off, it's going to need food, but for the entire life cycle. So if you have the space, think about what species of plants you can grow that can provide nectar and pollen for the adult pollinators for all 3 seasons in spring, summer, and fall. Also think about providing flowers of different sizes, shapes, and colors in the seasons, because different pollinators have preferences for different sizes, shapes, and colors. The little tiny bees, they love little tiny flowers, etc. And also besides providing nectar and pollen for the adults, you can actually turn your garden into a nursery by providing what we call host plants for the caterpillars of butterflies and moths. So paying attention to thinking like the organism, what does any organism, what do you need to survive, okay, can transform a garden into a conservation space. So if you've got a shady place, not deep, dark, dismal shade, but an open place, but it's shaded somewhat, okay, you can think about planting the flowers that grow in our woodlands in the spring, what's called the spring ephemerals. And they bloom early, April to May, because before all the foliage comes out in the leaves, in the trees above them to block the sun. So these are great for part shade gardens. For instance, Virginia bluebells, you can see a bumblebee over here on, the tubular flower, it's blue. And the celandine wood poppy, which can, naturalize beautifully in a backyard with the yellow and a different kind of open-faced flower. One of my favorite shrubs is the Bladder Nut Shrub. Kind of an awful sounding name, but I'm telling you, it is just covered in these groups of bell-shaped blossoms that come out. Mine is just starting to go away now. They came out earlier this month and have lasted for at least 3 weeks. There's also serviceberry shrub, a different kind of flower. And what's blooming great guns in my garden right now is the appendaged waterleaf, another great flower. Now, all of these, again, are providing food early in the spring, and you're lucky if you can grow these. It'll be a good thing because all these bees, these bumblebee queens, have been dormant all winter, but they're in torpor, but they've been using up their fat reserves. So they're popping out now, and they are wanting to start their nests. And by the way, they nest below ground. And they're hungry bumblebees, I tell you. And other native bees are doing the same thing. So these provide food right off the bat in the spring, right when these poor bees are coming out with a big appetite. A little later, another maybe 3 weeks or 4 in my garden, will be I'm just pushing this one because I just love this plant, the Missouri primrose. And in part, I love it a lot because the flowers, oh my gosh, they're like, it's a low growing plant, maybe 9 inches to a foot at best. It's great for the border, but the flowers are like 4 inches across. And I call them saucers of sunshine. And I really like them because see this green metallic bee here, Agapostamon bees, this type of sweat bee, but they look like little jewels, like little pins. Anyway, this is when I can count on seeing them in my garden. They go right for this flower and they look so pretty against that yellow. Another one, it'll bloom a little later, late May to late June, it'll bloom for a good 3 weeks, is what I call a pollinator magnet, St. John's, the shrubby St. John's wort. It's a woody plant, it's a shrub. And you can see all that pollen offering in this big halo circle down here where this bee is. And it's just fun watching the bees because they go crazy. They go crazy on these flowers. They go in circles and just dust themselves all up with pollen. It's great. Don't expect butterflies though, because this does not have nectar, doesn't make a nectar offering, just pollen, but lots of it. And the oak leaf hydrangea, which even the cultivars, I mean, it is a native species originally. And here it is with this big white, what you consider a cluster of flowers. And yeah, there are flowers there, but probably not the part of this that you think is the flower. It's signaling that white, it's saying, okay, guys, I'm ready, come and get it. But you know where the real flowers are? They're underneath. These are the real flowers, tiny, tiny little things. And I see all these little tiny Lasioglossum sweat bees in there a lot. These are sterile, what's called sterile bracts. They're just there to be like flags, just to say, hey, folks, we're ready for you. I also put this on here because people in the horticulture industry really push the Japanese ones, the ones with the great big, either white or pink or blue bunches of flowers. And They don't feed our pollinators hardly at all. When you go in there and look at these little tiny flowers that are there, there's fewer of them and there's hardly any bees in there. So the oak leaf hydrangea for hydrangea is your best bet. And there are 3 other species here too that are natives. Another favorite of mine is Anise hyssop or butterfly lady. And you got a population of these going, and it's pretty purple. It goes with any other color flower. It gets to 2, maybe at most 3 feet tall when it's real happy. But everybody loves this guy. Bees, you can see monarch butterflies like to nectar on it too. And I consider this single plant a win-win for nature and people, because if you like the flavor of anise, these leaves make the most delightful herb tea. I love it. I go out there, pick 5 leaves and put it in my mug and pour boiling water over it, and it's delicious. And then again, now it's fall, okay, or late summer to fall, and there are other plants you can plant. And this is a tall Coreopsis in my own yard, front yard, and it blooms for a good 3 weeks. And of course, the New England aster, and pictured here in these photos I took right here, is not a bee. It's a hoverfly that mimics a bee, and it's enjoying the offering, the pollen offering too, because they're all fattening up in the fall, late summer and fall, for getting ready for that winter, that long winter below ground for some of them. Now, how can you turn your garden into a nursery? Well, one of the most important ones, of course, that you probably all know about is supporting our monarch butterflies, because their populations are just plummeting to near extinction these days. And you can grow at least 5 or 6 milkweed species to support their caterpillars. But in the late summer, one of my favorites that blooms in late summer is the swamp milkweed. It doesn't ask much of you, and you don't have to have a swamp to grow it, just regular soil and regular watering. It blooms in August through September and attracts the butterfly to it. And then it says, hey, this is great for lunch, but look, I can lay my eggs here too. And they do. And they really enjoy it. There are some other plants you can grow for other species, like the spice bush with Lindera benzoin, a native of our woodlands. You can grow it easily in your yards, part sun, part shade. It supports the spice bush butterfly. And here's a spice bush caterpillar with those fake eyes. Cool. And if you like pawpaws, you can grow pawpaw trees, okay? And it is the host for the zebra swallowtail caterpillar. Oh my gosh, that is an astounding butterfly to see if you have it around. I love it. So there are other ways to manage your yard to support wildlife other than providing food and for the adults or caterpillars. What else do insects and birds need? Well, they need freedom from unsafe chemicals, for starters, and insecticides. And maybe you've never seen this, but we all love fireflies. At least I haven't met a person who doesn't love a firefly. But for 11 months of the year, fireflies live in a larval form that you see here in the upper left. And they live in the soil, and they're carnivorous. They eat things like little slugs and little worms, little other things. And here you see a rather elongated firefly larva with its head stuck in a snail shell. It ate the snail. So if you're dousing your yards with insecticide, your entire soil food web is going to go, and that includes the firefly. And you'll miss out on those lovely fireflies later, in the summer when they come out for a month to mate as the adult form. And you say, well, heck, I don't put insecticides in my garden. Well, a lot of people are, and they're doing this. They are, all this business has really taken off in the last, I'd say, 5 years in my neighborhood. Mosquito, 911, all these other ones that these guys come out and they spray insecticides to get rid of mosquitoes. Well, they're not just getting rid of mosquitoes, they're spraying, and they'll say, oh yeah, it's organic based, blah, blah, but it's a neurotoxin. I don't care if it's organic based. It's a neurotoxin for insects, and it kills them all dead. Some of them say, well, we're careful not to damage the bees. We don't spray very high during the day when the bees are around. Well, guess where all that stuff falls out? On the soil. And guess where 70% of our native bees nest? Underground in the soil. It's there are other ways to control mosquitoes, let's just say. I won't get into that today. But why miss out on the fireflies in the summer because of insecticides? The other thing to be aware of is night lighting, though. The adult firefly really doesn't like it. The females on the ground are trying to recognize above the flash pattern of number one, their own species of firefly, and number two, within their own species, who's the coolest male, who's the one I want to mate with, right? And it's subtle differences in the flashing intensity and repeat pauses, etc. Pauses between flashes. They're trying to discriminate to decide who they'll flash back at and say, okay, honey, come on down. So when we have a lot of bright night lighting, it just doesn't allow them to see those patterns as clearly. And night lighting is a huge issue for them, as well as for moths. I would like to make a sign to put out for that 1 month of mating season for the fireflies that says this: it's firefly mating season. Let's help them do it in the dark. Can we have trip lights or something instead of lights that are on all night, basically, at least for the month that they're mating? Other things you can do in your garden: provide verticality, leave dead wood when you can. This tree trunk that was half cut off, but they didn't get rid of it all. Anyway, it hollowed out and was just a great nesting site for the Carolina wren. And this is near my my backyard's over this way. Anyway, it was great watching that families of them for like 7 years. Other things you can do is leave flower stalks up over winter and through the spring, because they are bee nests for certainly the Serotina bee, which is you can see down here. What I do is cut them down to about 2 feet above. I make sure that it's sturdy and not falling over. And if they're sturdy, I cut them to about 2 feet above the ground in fall. And then in the spring, sometime in March, I'll cut maybe the next top 3 or 4 inches off of that, or a little more, and leave them there for these little guys to find. They emerge from other stalks, so you have to kind of commit to leaving stalks up for a while. But the plant is going to grow back up over those stalks and mask it anyway, so it's not going to look untidy, at least if you think it does, for very long. But these bees, you can see how they're making holes in the pith in those stems and crawling down there and laying eggs. And they make these chambers in there, put pollen in, separate them with sawdust from the pith, and later the eggs hatch into larvae. You can see the bee larva right there. And they eat the pollen that's put there. And later the mom keeps feeding them, even in adulthood. And then they come out the next spring and mate and start the process all over again. And you probably heard this too. Please consider leaving the leaves, or as many as you can, and raking them under shrubs. They're mulch and fertilizer all in one. Why throw it away? And please, no leaf blowers, and don't mow them up to chop them up, because guess what? A lot of these leaves, have not cocoons, I'm sorry, chrysalises of butterflies attached to them. These are just 2 species: the owl butterfly chrysalis and the spice bush swallowtail chrysalis that look like leaves themselves. And they drop down, they fall down with the leaves, and they get covered up by more leaves, and that's how they overwinter. So if you gently rake them somewhere, they'll do pretty good. And even though I told you just now to leave the leaves, consider leaving some bare spots and in places unmulched. because that's what ground nesting bees like bumblebees are looking for their nests. This one's digging out a nest. And here's a little bee sticking its head out of its little burrow where they lay eggs and raise their young. Now, if you want to bump it up a notch, this is a great quote I heard from someone else, but individuals can make the biggest changes by not acting as individuals. There are different ways to act together to make an even bigger difference. Again, organisms need all these things to survive, okay, that I just went through, and they need mobility to find them all. What are the odds that your single yard can supply all of these things for these species? No, not that good for many of them. So what if we talk to our neighbors and link up on gardens? Perhaps start a neighborhood adopt a species campaign. That's one of my ideas that I'm hoping we can get going somewhere in town. And it could be, you could be a source of neighborhood pride. You could adopt a species emblem or art, sort of like here's the Tree City USA thing, but people could do their own art and say, well, if this neighborhood supports everything that's needed by, say, the Eastern Black Swallowtail, kids can get into the act and research. You can research, what do they need to complete a life cycle? Can we supply it in several yards, at least, on my street? Or maybe adopt the Carolina wren or the screech owl, or even adopt the firefly. And you might think that's impossible, but I can tell you that this fellow, Tim Wong, repopulated San Francisco from his own backyard. It was going locally extinct. He saved 5 caterpillars, grew the pipevine in his backyard, fed it to them, and started a colony. He's raising swallowtail, these pipevine swallowtail butterflies from his backyard and giving them away, or, a lot of botanical gardens and parks are wanting them and trying to reestablish this. And he did it all by himself. That's biophilia talking. So there's another thing I won't spend too much time on this, but just go look up Hedgehog Street and do yourself a favor and put a big smile on your face. This is in Great Britain, and it is a true conservation effort to save the hedgehog in their residential areas. It's community-based conservation in residential areas. It was totally thought through by scientists at these two societies before it got started, for years actually, proposals getting it worked out. And they have, basically, like they say, no one garden's enough, got to have linked up gardens. And they now have about 100,000 people in Great Britain registered as gardens that support the hedgehog. And they have a great interactive website. It really is professional and fabulous. And, these people make their yards friendly for the hedgehog. They get rid of barriers to their movement and make sure their fences, they can scoot under their fences. Look at these guys. They're so darn cute. But what motivates these people? Biophilia. They just love the hedgehog and they want to be hedgehog champions. And you around here or in the nation can join groups that provide continued knowledge and may be involved in legislative action, which I wanted to highlight a couple. It's another way where together we can make a difference. And I'd like to just call, Wild Ones Native Plants, Natural Landscapes. We have here in Louisville have a chapter and a group, Wild Ones Louisville group on Facebook, but there is the national national up here with lots of good advice. National Audubon Society. They have a plant app that works by zip codes if you're interested in planting for birds. And the invertebrate par excellence, the Invertebrate Conservation Society in the USA, is the Xerces Society. And they give certification, just as there is Tree City USA, there's a Bee City USA certification. Wouldn't it be great if Louisville could do that? There's also Bee Campus USA. I'd love for U of L to do that. And we need new government policies and rules. Two that I want to showcase is The need for the horticultural industry to wake up and stop selling and trading invasive plants. They're not going to do it on their own. People, they keep saying, well, people like them, we're going to sell them. But some states have already done so and passed laws banning dozens of these from sale and trade in their states. You see the ones I could find online here, and Missouri's thinking about it. Also, I want you to know that homeowner associations, in terms of that, just last month, the Maryland State Senate unanimously passed a House bill which ends the ability of homeowner associations in Maryland to ban pollinator and wildlife-friendly gardens and bans them from requiring turf grass. Whoa, big deal. It's the only one I know of. And we need policies to stimulate our native plant growers and sellers. One just passed the Senate, the New Jersey Senate, and it is has a lot of things in it, but amongst them is the promotion requiring garden centers to have a section to sell native plants. So things are on the move. Maybe Kentucky can catch up. There's a lot of win-win for people. I know I'm droning on here. Don't want to lose you totally, but they're useful. If you grow native plants in your garden, you will bring more pollinators to your vegetable garden and get more fruit. For instance, when the bumblebees come to your tomatoes or peppers or eggplants, okay, they're known as buzz pollinators. They're the only ones that can really effectively pollinate those flowers. Do you think they're just waiting around, not eating until your tomato and flowers are blooming? No, they need other plants to have been blooming for months previously. And that's what growing, early to mid-season and late native plants can do for your tomatoes. There's also a native bee that is a specialist on the squash bee. It's so cute. I had to just show you some pictures of it. The males sleep inside the blossoms at night. Also, birds can pick insect pests off trees and garden plants. And if you have native plants, you're going to use less water, fertilizer, no pesticide needed, and no gasoline needed. It improves your personal health and your community's health. So basically, the big win for people is local nature at your doorstep and sustaining what I call human nature relationships for our children. And you got to get them young, because you know as well as I that the temptation and call of the computer and television screen is really dominant. But getting them outside and getting them curious, about nature and their doorstep would be just a fantastic thing to promote. And it's educational enrichment for the kids. Also, having a garden gets us off the couch. Goodness knows more of us need to do that. And especially look at our high school student here in Kentucky, high school student obesity, 20%, and it's up from 2003. It also gives us, I think, a positive and joyful common ground to share with our neighbors, family, and children. And goodness knows we need more positive and joyful common ground in this country. And talking about plants and the generosity of gardeners is a way to do it. It can also, be a source of neighborhood identity and pride and stewardship of our local biological heritage. And it sustains God's creation. It doesn't despoil it. You can be a part of that. And we can, encourage more of that in lots of ways. I'm going to just rush through some of this. We need information, but we need local support systems, because it's true, as we age, sometimes the spirit is willing, but the back ain't what it used to be. And we need landscaping support. And believe it or not, these are kids just in the Louisville area who wanted to help their neighbors with gardening. And perhaps they could learn something about plants and gardening from you. That's a good exchange. Of course, church groups could promote it and give the kids rewards, recognition. There's Eagle Scout badges, for help in gardening, and knowledge in gardening and native plants that could be a way to do this, but you know, that's okay for now. But basically, if this is going to take off as an idea, we need professional outsourcing if we're going to replace lawns with native plants in a big way. Expand landscape training. Let's not just have the, you know, Rambo gardening style that is out there right now when we outsource landscaping. So it can be a win-win for both nature and people. And, you know, so I'll just end with, you know, again, people in cities and towns can play a very important role in native species conservation. And we can do so by keeping our common species, our common native species, common. Here's someone one block over has a different kind of garden than mine, but you know, someone in my neighborhood gets it, and it's all about making an offering to nature. So thanks. I hope we can keep this conversation going. And I'll end with this quote from St. Francis of Assisi. God requires that we assist the animals when they need our help, because each being has the same right of protection. Thanks a lot.